Hi, everybody, and welcome to another conversation with TLC. Today, we're doing things slightly differently. Instead of our panel of 3 to 5 experts, we have asked some of our TLC members to share use cases in experimentation. We have a lot to go through, and we may run out of time, and if we do, we will schedule a follow-up call to get through more of them. And if you guys enjoy this format and you get a lot out of it, this may become a regular thing that we do maybe once a quarter, where you guys can come and share recent use cases or unique use cases or whatever is going to be helpful. All right, so let's get started. And the folks that are going to be sharing today are Chad Sanderson, currently of Sephora, most recently of Subway, Merritt Aho of Dun Bradstreet, Tony Fiera. I always do this bad, Tony. Tony Fiera. Can I say like Ferrari and just call it good? Anyway, it's Tony at Republic Wireless, Joe Sanders of Comcast, Catherine Johnson of T. Rowe Price, Kano of Crocs, and Paula Sappington, if she has time. She may have to drop before we get to her, of Hilton. And any of them we're just going to go in order, from starting with Chad and moving across, and then move down to Catherine and across. And if we run out of time, like I said, we will follow up with additional times to meet again. And each of our panelists, I guess, each of our sharers are going to share in about anywhere from like 2 to 5 minutes a story explaining to you their use case. Then we will pause and open it up for all of you to ask questions. You can do so on the TLC, or you can take yourself off mute and just ask questions, or you can type it in the group chat. Make sense? Any questions before we get started? Nope. All right. Mr. Chad, you may take it away, sir. Do you see where the share capability is there? Let me turn off the share so that you can have it. There you go.
Oh, sure. Okay. So let me know if I ever start kind of wobbling and going in and out. My internet connection is a little bit shaky this morning. Okay. So first of all, just quickly introduce myself. I'm Chad Sanderson. I'm the Senior Experimentation Product Manager for Sephora, and I'm also the former Program Manager of Experimentation at Subway restaurants. And the use case that we're going to talk about today is a little bit different, I think, from the digital A/B testing fair that we normally get into. We were focusing on offline testing. So specifically offline A/B testing done in a slightly unusual way. So we had a problem at Subway, and the problem was we had a in-store technology that we wanted to roll out, and that technology was a kiosk. So when you go into a Subway, you can go in, there are some stores right now where it actually works. You have kiosks and you can place those orders at the front of the store. So you don't have to wait in line. You can make your order, use a credit card, and then go in and pick your order up when it's ready. But the problem was, when we were rolling this out and developing it as a POC, we realized we weren't sure of whether or not this kiosk was actually going to drive incremental revenue. So what we had to do was launch a bit of a concept, a test in stores that had opted in to using kiosks, and then figure out how to do an experiment to measure statistically whether or not we were actually increasing margin in the way that we thought we would. Now, we couldn't do this in a normal way, right? We couldn't just say, well, we want everybody in a certain set of stores that we'll call a control to get nothing, and then everybody in another certain set of stores to get this kiosk value, and then measure the average order value that way. We couldn't actually do that for a couple of reasons. The first reason is because the incrementality was so small, right? Only a small percent of people were using kiosks in the first place, something like 5%. And then the incremental revenue on top of that was only an additional 5 or 6%. So the number of samples we would need, and in this case, samples where the stores themselves would be massive. This is a study that would either consume the entire United States, which has a large physical cost attached to it, or would just take a really, really long period of time, something over like the course of years. So we decided to do a different type of study. It's called a within study design. In digital A/B testing, we're usually using between study designs. That's what they're called. It's when you have everybody, every single person in your control only sees the control, and every single person in your treatment group only sees that treatment group. But in a within study design, every single person in your study sees both the control and the treatment group. It's actually used a lot in medical research when you care about seeing the effects of a drug in combination or in a particular sequence. And in our case, the sequence that we cared about was what happens when somebody goes in and places an order at the front counter in the typical fashion, and then at some point places an order on a kiosk. So, and then there's a few things that you can measure in that case. You can measure at the individual level, are we seeing incremental improvement from the first time that somebody's ordering on a kiosk from the last time they ordered on the front counter? Or you can come up with averages. So you can say, I care about the cumulative, the average number of times that somebody used the front counter versus the average order value after they use kiosk for the first time. So you're checking if there was an effect on order values or maybe frequency after they used this kiosk. Was there a change point that caused something to happen? And this was actually an extremely valuable experiment for us, because there were many things that we measured that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise if we had just looked at the net sort of averages of these two order values. The first interesting thing that we saw is on average, there was a lower order value on kiosk than there was at the front counter. So that was what initially got people to say, well, maybe this isn't a really good investment. But what we found out after looking at this person-to-person test is that the type of people who were making these orders were actually ordering lower sandwich amounts. Okay, so they were going from ordering 2 or 3 sandwiches to primarily ordering a single sandwich, which is not indicating that the kiosk is causing people to order one sandwich, but maybe that in this case their behavior is changing. Maybe they'll order a kiosk when they're by themselves. Or maybe if there's a group of people ordering together, whereas maybe they would have ordered that on a single account, now they're splitting up and one person is making their order and then they're making their order again. And so when we were able to break the data out that way, we were able to see incremental lifts on some pretty specific order types. And because it was an experiment, then we were able to have all the standard experimental values, so p-values and confidence intervals, and then we could use that data to make really solid projections about what the lift would be if we roll this out to other stores, right? Because instead of just saying, well, this is what we think it's going to be based on an industry average, or this is what we think it's going to be based on like an aggregate average that we're just looking at based on order counts, then we can say we have a margin of error, we have a confidence interval, and we have a p-value that gives us a pretty solid level of risk when we're taking this to other stores, and when we talk to franchisees about needing them to buy in or pay for this service moving forward. So I don't know if that was 5 minutes or not. If it's not, I can keep talking.
No, you're good. It's 3 to 5. You're fine.
Okay.
That makes a lot of sense. So from the outcome of doing it, you were able to give more guided recommendations to help them understand both the cost and the ROI of implementing the kiosks.
That's right. That's right. And one of the things that we found out is that this type of kiosk is not going to be valuable for every single store out there. It's only going to be valuable for certain stores that have a certain type of order makeup. So for example, one of the highest ROI items that we saw in terms of AOV were people who were purchasing 2 6-inch sandwiches, just as an example. What was happening was on the kiosk, people who were doing this were adding a lot of the upsell items that are promoted on kiosk, things like additional cookies and other different types of like add-ons and things like double meat and stuff like that. Whereas on certain sandwiches, just like maybe a single foot long, people weren't as willing to do that. So if you had a store that was almost, 90% or 80% single foot long sandwiches and very, very few people were ordering in bunches, then maybe that's not a store that we would recommend adding this kiosk to in the first place.
Makes sense. You have a question over on this calls channel from Merritt. He wants to know, he said, seems to me like this type of concept can introduce a large novelty bias. How did you address this in your estimates of long-term effects?
Yeah, well, that's so anytime, well, a couple things there. The first one is marketers are kind of spoiled a little bit when it comes to testing, because the testing that we're familiar with or initially familiar with is called the randomized control trial. And that's really the gold standard of experimentation in the scientific world. That's like literal best case scenario in all possible worlds. But the vast majority of science out there doesn't have that. Like if you're a medical researcher and you're conducting research on a very rare disease, you can't use a randomized controlled trial because there's not that many people to do in the first place. So a lot of the types of methods that are available aren't perfect. They do have something called internal errors of validity or validity errors. And those are things that we have to be aware of and we have to take into account and then express that to leadership. So for example, one of them might be if there was something that happened in the larger subway sense or in the larger sense of the world that is causing people to change their behavior during the time that the experiment launches, that's not something we would be able to tell from this study. Like for example, if some new campaign ran on Subway and it said, hey, you get some great discount if you start ordering a lot more items or something like that. That would have an effect. So those are things that we would have to look for on the Subway side, and then we'd also have to go out into the world and make sure that there's nothing reasonable that we can observe that would have an effect on this type of study over time.
Melanie is asking, was there any qualitative measure taken? So did you try to measure or increase or decrease? Did you try to measure the increase or decrease in customer satisfaction for customers using the kiosk versus direct?
Yeah, so customer satisfaction is definitely something that we cared about. It wasn't really the focus of this study because like Melanie was saying, that is more of a qualitative look, and this is more of a quantitative experiment. Now, the things that we did care about, we didn't just look at cumulative averages, but we also looked at conversion rates. So looking at something like did the makeup change? Was the things that people were ordering in terms of how many sandwiches they were ordering on average as a rate change? So on the front counter, 10% of people were ordering double footlongs. Did that change versus on the kiosk? Or did the type of sandwich that was ordered on one change versus on the other? So it was mainly very similar to the things that we analyze when we're looking online, but we did have a lot more because each person was we had a row of data. Then we can perform some pretty advanced queries on how deep we wanted to go on the quantitative side, but there was actually another team doing a lot of the qualitative research.
Awesome. Okay, we're at time. We're going to switch to our next panelist, but anybody who has more questions for Chad, ask them over in the channel. Chad, I encourage you to answer over there. All right, next up is Merritt.
Unmute here. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. So I want to share a test use case. And I think there were some things that made this really interesting for us. I'm more interested in talking here about the process that we used for this test and how that contributed to it being a large success for us. And I'll start by saying I don't know what you've seen in your experience, but I have seen many large redesign projects end up in disaster and failure, and end up in all hands fire drills post-launch to figure out why things are going so terribly wrong. I've also, I don't know how things work at your company, but at our company, management has a bias for large redesign projects. So it is something that we face on a fairly regular basis, and it's sort of a battle to get people to follow a sound process. But we did have one very successful launch. One of our sites, hoovers.com, has a business directory, and what it is it's a window into our commercial database by basically showing you a profile of most companies in the United States. So there are millions of pages in this directory, and it's existed for a long time, and it has gained a lot of attention from Google, and so we get a substantial amount of traffic, over 1 million unique visitors on a monthly basis, most of those coming from organic Google search results. So I'm showing a small thumbnail of the old page that's showing on the left there, and the new page. And we had a number of reasons, strategic from an SEO perspective, that we wanted to sort of redo these pages, but it was also pretty clear to us that it was sort of an outdated experience, which by itself is not necessarily a reason to redesign, but that's what some of our management was looking at. So we ended up with a 35% improvement in conversion rate. That was not during the test. During the test, it was even higher than that. This was sustained after implementation. So it was a tremendous success. I mean, I almost wanted to take the rest of the year off because it made a big impact on the business. But again, I want to talk about how we got to that point, because it wasn't a straightforward A/B test. Let's see. We started with research. We didn't have any. At the time, we weren't doing much surveying on our websites, and so we just threw up a quick and dirty Hotjar survey. It's kind of classic user intent and task completion analysis. And we left a lot of stuff that was open form here, so the analysis of the survey was pretty intense, but we got a lot of great data about what people were trying to do, because we were showing up in all kinds of search results. And oftentimes it wasn't the right audience, and so we wanted to make sure that of the people who were the right audience, what were they struggling with on the site. So we started with real problems rather than assuming we knew what the answers were. There were a lot of different teams involved in the design process here, and one of them was an agency, a design agency. And so we took this data, highlighting the user issues on the pages, and then we went through design and usability testing. So came up with prototypes. And we did this a couple different times. We used usertesting.com. We actually engaged their professional services for this one to help out with the user testing process. But it really helped us to get a sense for the direction that we needed to go with the designs, what was being understood clearly and what was helpful and what wasn't helpful. And again, we went through a couple iterations of this before we even started developing. And then, of course, afterwards, we went forward with the development process and a rollout. And here again, we're sort of scratching our heads and wondering, what's the best way to do this? Should we do an opt-in, sort of what you see on the right, where we pop up an invitation to, hey, try out the new version of this page? Because there was a fairly significant amount of return traffic, and we didn't want to confuse them too much. And we also just try to redirect, which I was really nervous about the redirects, because it was a JavaScript-based redirect. We couldn't manage to do it server side, and so that added to the page load time. But I'm really, really glad that we chose to do both of these, because we learned very early on that people were not interested in the opt-in beta version. We had very, very low acceptance rate, in spite of the fact that it was a pretty sizable pop-up that came over their screen to invite them to the new experience. So it ended up pulling that one out because we just weren't collecting very good data. And the test ran for a couple weeks. And again, we saw like a 50% improvement in conversion rate throughout most of the test. And then we implemented it as quickly as we could because it was worth a tremendous amount of money. This to me was like the ideal. I wish I could say that all of our test cases went like this, right? Where it started with really, really good research and then went through, an iterative design process and then ended up in a really successful A/B test. But I really like this because I think this is the ideal for us, and how I'd like to manage every single redesign project that we have. Again, unfortunately, that's not the case, and probably dealing with more massive redesigns than business can really benefit from. But it is what it is. And anyways, that's about it. Any questions?
Awesome. Questions, folks? While they type and think about questions, I have questions. You said they didn't like the opt-in and that they didn't even try it, but they were really happy with the experience when you sort of forced them into it based on the improvements in conversion rate. Of the very small number of people that opted in, were they happy?
It was difficult to tell. Conversion rate was good. And by the way, I should say that we paired this with a survey. We actually sampled the sample with surveys to try to get a sense of how, what they liked about the designs.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot to mention that fact, but it was really difficult to tell. I mean, the data just wasn't clear. It wasn't big enough, and it just wasn't adding any value from a data perspective.
And this is typically something that we call, like massive redesign or whatever. And in those scenarios, you can either just start with something huge and totally different, or you can test elements of it into the new design. Which route did you guys take?
It was huge redesign.
There was research that fed into it, which you explained, but not necessarily testing. Right.
I mean, we did some testing leading up to it, but that was impetus from above. People were just impatient. They didn't want to take the iterative approach, which is what I prefer in most cases. Like, hey, we can do a couple things at a time here and learn what really makes a difference. But
yeah, and radical redesign, sometimes if you have a significantly old and dated design, sometimes a radical redesign is the way to go, and then we can optimize going forward and run some interesting multivariate experiences for the purposes of learning which elements matter the most, as opposed to trying to optimize. So there's still plenty of room in there, but it's pretty amazing to see that much lift.
And I would say this kind of hurts me from the argument perspective of saying, like, hey, let's not do massive redesigns all the time, because we are just going to point at this and say, like, oh, we did this and it was a 35% increase. Like, yeah, but
that doesn't happen very often. Yeah, it depends on where you start from. Anyone else? Anybody have any more questions for Mr. Merritt?
I just want to say I do think Merritt should be able to take the rest of the year off.
Yeah, and get a hella pay raise.
Right, yeah. I don't know why that idea is not taken off here.
I know, right? Just give me a little bonus equal to the amount of lift that I provided. Yeah,
you've set the bar. You've set the bar too high now. You realize that.
Yeah, you've peaked. All right. If anybody has any more questions, add them on the TLC calls channel and the TLC Slack, and we'll move on to Tony.
All right. So I am in a unique situation. Looking at all the other companies of the people sharing use cases. I work for a startup cell phone service company that's trying to compete with some of the major companies out there. And I've been here for about a year, and I sort of own the digital experience. So the use case that I'm sharing is sort of a full experience experiment that we did that started small and then just kept getting bigger and bigger. So basically at the end, what happened was we started with very targeted persona-based audiences and paid media, where we drove them through a unique landing page experience over to our e-commerce site, where we tested some personalization experiences based on that persona group. So it started in the paid media space, where we took personas and we got extremely targeted in different channels, drove them to a specific landing page that brought a lot of that messaging over, and then tried to follow that onto our website for each individual persona base to see what we could do. And every time we tried something different, you know, the metrics kept showing more and more interesting things. The place where we are today basically is based on those experiences, depending upon which persona you sit in, we are actually not just showing a unique experience, but we're actually providing new functionality to that persona so that we can cut costs for the back-end support side as well. So a good example of that is, depending upon who you are, you may get live chat or you may not. And that's all based on the digital footprint that you left from that start to finish, knowing that if you start a chat, we actually save money on you compared to other people. And some of the interesting things we found were, we actually saw a 400% increase in a single channel for traffic, which was extremely surprising. We saw the fact that paid media drove a direct impact on organic channels when we didn't do any organic activities. So no blog writing, nothing else, just paid media alone drove an increase on those as well. And then traffic drove a direct correlation to our corporate KPIs, which was an interesting fact. And the last little piece that was really interesting for me, sort of being in conversion rate optimization in the past as well, even with that increase in traffic, we were able to keep a consistent conversion rate, which usually you see the correlation on the opposite side.
So you weren't just driving traffic, you were driving qualified traffic.
Correct, yeah. So we learned that being really targeted to a specific degree and driving those people to the site without doing anything on the site and any changes to the site, we were able to keep a consistent conversion rate just by driving a little bit more traffic. So basically, end to end, it was, you know, multiple channels in the beginning, using very specific technology, driving a qualified experience, and then understanding what that experience meant in terms of cost savings and conversion to be able to either invest more money in the front end or provide newer technology on the back end.
Wow.
So there was a lot to it. And it's the one thing to take away from this, which is, you know, we're still taking away from it, is it never stops, right? So for a few months, we saw a really good increase month over month in conversions and sales. But then after that second month, we had to re-optimize that experience, even from start to finish, to make sure that we didn't start seeing sort of a plateau or decline at that sense. Because once people start getting used to an experience, they sort of start expecting a better experience consistently.
Interesting. And okay, so I have so many questions, and I don't want to take everybody else's time. So if you have questions, start typing and I will defer to you. But question number one, if having them engage with chat is such a great cost savings, why would you limit the number of people that you expose to chat? Is it based on their propensity for using chat, or?
It's based on the persona. So different personas hit different age groups, and we found through our industry, there are certain age groups that want to talk on the phone. So if you go through chat, it takes longer to communicate the solution, which means it's an increase in price. So we've just sort of cut the gates to that and have just given the channels to the people that need them in the way that they need them.
That makes a ton of sense, actually. I've heard the same about certain audiences that prefer the phone. And then you described the different impacts. You described the scent trail, and then once they got there, they were exposed to different experiences or technology that maybe were relevant for their use case. But what did you do differently on the media side for targeting the different personas? So maybe use as an example one who an older versus younger, or whatever. How did you target the experience out there in the paid media space?
So the paid media piece was more imagery and messaging, and making sure that we were creating a perceived expectation that we could deliver throughout that matched to them.
Focusing on different value props that are more likely to be of interest to the different personas.
Yeah, so for us in the wireless industry, someone who's older, not all cases, but the majority, don't want the newest iPhone because of they don't want the face recognition to log in, and it's just way too much. So presenting them with phones that match to their capabilities and why they'd be using it have been very beneficial.
That makes tons of sense. Anyone else? Any other questions? All right. Thank you, Tony. Really appreciate it. If you guys have more questions, throw them in the TLC calls channel. And we will move on. Next is Joe.
Hey everyone, my name is Joe Sanders. I'm at Comcast and I manage our experiments team and more recently our personalization team. So it's a new, sort of a new responsibility for me in the last few months. So I'm very much in learning mode for personalization and how we can start to use it more, not only in our tests, but more broadly across our digital experiences. And we're starting to do more personalization in the A/B and multivariate tests that we run. But we are kind of in this this period of investigating new technologies and new platforms that we can use. So we're definitely in learning mode and trying to figure out the best ways forward for personalization, and testing has been a great starting point. So the example I'm going to share today is it's an e-commerce example. So the business objective here was really just to drive conversion rate and ARPU among non-subscribers who are coming to our site to learn about services. So in this example, I think sort of the challenge that we were up against was that we know offers work, but we didn't have a way to scale a personalized homepage experience that had an offer embedded in it. So the control group in our test had an offer, and the treatment or the test experience did not have an offer. So the degree to which we could make the message and the creative resonate with a customer had to overcome the fact that there was no offer included there. So we had a sort of a high bar. So in this case, what we did was we used third-party audience data to create key segments around certain passion points. So in this particular example, this is a visitor to our site who we believe is more likely than average to be a person who is in a family with kids. And so you can see that the experience speaks to the needs of that group. And what we were really trying to do here is, if you think about the sales experience you might have if you called a call center to learn about internet and TV service, that agent would have a discussion with you first, ask questions about your content preferences. What do you watch? Do you have kids in the household? Do you watch sports? And really try to understand what you need before making the pitch. When we don't personalize the website, we're creating that one-size-fits-all offer, which is usually value-based. And that really works well. But in this case, we wanted to anticipate the needs of this shopper. And so what we actually executed was a campaign where the test design was we had 5 target audience groups, and 100% of the people who fit into those 5 segments were included in the test, but half of them saw BAU and half of them saw the treatment. And some of the segments performed really well to the test treatment, others did not. This particular segment, the family with kids, performed really well. But the test overall, when having personalization always on versus personalization always off, that kind of test experience drove a 5.5% lift in revenue per visit. Pales in comparison to Merritt's 35%, but we're pretty proud of it. And again, the key challenge here for us was overcoming the fact that there was no offer. So we saw something interesting, but maybe should have been expected. And that was, we ran this test for about 45 days. We reached full confidence in the revenue per visit lift. And that it started to kind of stabilize and level out at that, roughly 5.5% lift. But then status quo changed. So we actually had a more competitive offer that we had on our website. And so now in that new scenario, the control group had a much more aggressive or much more competitive offer. and it made it harder for personalization to compete with it. And so we saw the numbers change dramatically after that point in time, which is why. So I guess what we learned from this is this type of persona-based or passion point segment-based personalization can work in a normal season of business, but in a period of time where we have a particularly competitive offer, we have to get that in front of our customers because that does work. So the next iteration of this is to merge these concepts together and have the offer embedded in a personalized experience. So in this example on the right, we're basically slicing that top section of the homepage into 3 zones, each of which will be an independent decision, one for creative, one for message, and one for offer. So that's sort of the future state that we're working toward right now. But that's the use case. We used, just in terms of the technology, so we used Audience Manager. So we use a lot of Adobe tools here. So we used Adobe Target for the testing. We used Adobe Audience Manager for the segment creation. And the segment was an audience made up of multiple data sources with sort of an or command, or either we have this evidence that you belong to the segment, or this evidence, or this evidence. So it was a sort of a complex segment that we used, but that was executed through Audience Manager and an integration with Target. So that's it. Any questions?
All right. Again, if you have questions, although if you get a chance, Joe, you should totally look in the calls channel, because they're razzing you a little bit about only getting to take a month off with your 5% lift instead of Merritt's 35% lift. But so the future testing on the right there, oh, look, somebody's drawing, where you have the 3 different things. Are you using the machine learning or some sort of personalization to determine what each of the 3 are going to be, and are they targeted to the specific audience? And if so, is there any fail-safe to make sure that they actually don't conflict with each other or have a negative impact? So you don't get like a silly, like you've got more speed, better entertainment, bigger value, and then you've got a little kid playing on a tablet.
Yep. So we're carefully planning so we want this to scale, but we also want to make sure that there isn't some permutation out there that does clash like that. So I think an example we've thought of is, what if the creative is about sports, but the offer that gets selected is a package that just doesn't have a great sports tier in it? So we're going to spend a lot of time thinking through some of those permutations that we would want to exclude. Mm-hmm. I think in to the first part of your question, the first iteration of this 3-part hero section will be rules-based. Mm-hmm. And in parallel, we'll be using machine learning to kind of replicate what we did in the original test, which is sort of a locked up creative and message. So we'll have a couple of permutations, maybe 5 or 10, that we load in and let see if the algorithm can beat what we did with rules-based. Awesome. I think over time we'll start to have this, the version on the right with the multiple zones. I think over time we'll start to use machine learning for that, but it's a little further out, and I think there's a little bit more complexity there that we need to manage too.
All right, you got a few questions in the Slack channel and in the Zoom chat. So I'm going to start with Merritt. He asks, number 1, are you planning to use Target for the machine learning multivariate?
Yeah, we're starting with Target. So this is the Adobe Target Premium tier that they have. So we have that activated today, and we are trialing that today. So we'll see how that goes. We haven't made sort of a long-term commitment to use that, and we certainly want to consider other options. As I said, I'm pretty new to the personalization side of the house, and so I'm still getting up to speed on potential platforms and capabilities out there. But we definitely we have a lot of I guess we're pretty optimistic about being able to use Target for this.
Awesome. And then Merritt also is curious about how many permutations you think you'll end up with. He says scaling the content and maintaining the scale is daunting to him. Do you guys have any issues with the content pipeline?
So we don't have issues with the production of the content, but what we have found with some of our early trials with machine learning is just like with any test, you need to fuel it with traffic. And for a machine learning, the more permutations you have, the more traffic you need. Well, the more models that you have, the more traffic that you'll need. And so we found that, we were looking, just like with an A/B test, where sometimes you know what you want to test, but you don't have time. And so you start to make sort of some compromises to change your experiment design so that it fits within a shorter window. That's sort of what we had to do. So we had to limit the number of creative executions so that the models would be built and could be deployed in a reasonable amount of time for the trial. So I think the same challenges there, where you want to sort of be very judicious with the traffic that's going into this test versus others. And I think we'll have to limit the number of executions in the short term. Over time, I don't know. I mean, it's a frontier for us. We have a lot of learning to do there.
All right, one more question and then we'll move on from Paul Legutko. He says, are you worried that your persona-based targeting could conflict with any offer-based targeting? For example, don't give the offer to people who would likely buy anyway. Which would you prioritize, persona or offer?
That's a good question, and I think it gets into so there are several predictive models that we could use in this particular case, and so we're thinking about which ones would be prioritized in a scenario where there are multiple models available. So I think the short answer is we're aware of the risk of that happening, where we pick the wrong one, but sort of arbitration of models is very top of mind for us right now.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate it. If you guys have more questions, ask them in the TLC calls channel, and we will move on to Kano.
All right. So that's probably actually a good segue. I think that, we've been talking a lot about in our company, understanding the different sort of customer groups and segmentation. And so one of the hot areas of conversation among our executive team really was, can we identify those people who are in market and motivated versus people who might need an extra nudge? And so, we've been looking a lot at, let's see if I can get my screen share going here. We were looking a lot at some segmentation and trying to understand this. And can everybody see that slide? That's good. All right. So with the goal in mind, we were trying to just identify some of these customer segments, and we had come up with some modeling that differentiated two groups, which really looked like we had identified what I'm going to call from all of our customers, people who typically looked for discounts before they purchased, and people who were sort of agnostic to whether or not there was a promotion or the outlet products that we sold. So again, e-commerce example here. But if we thought that if we could identify these two groups, that we'd have some interesting opportunities that we could either take those discount seekers, and when we identify them on site, we could throw them a little extra offer to say, hey, go ahead and close out your cart and purchase now. Or we could exclude people selectively if they don't need that promotion if they don't find that as an incentive. And so we just had this theory that if this holds true, that we could make a lot of savings, both top and bottom line, incremental sales. But then we could also extrapolate this to all of our visitors. And if we could find some sort of commonalities in how the behaviors of those customers, then we could extrapolate into these lookalike models and have these larger segments that we could apply. And so, all this together would be, a big win for the team. I just sort of, I considered it similar to what you do at a car dealership. If you come in with a car being towed by a tow truck, the person selling you a car has a different idea of the different discounts and offers they're going to give you versus somebody who's driving a 1-year-old car. So we're trying to emulate that on our site. But we come up with these models, and we had basically decided that we would put together a promotional offer. I think it was a 25% off offer. And we split these groups. So there's basically 2 A/B tests that were happening, one for the discount seekers and one for the full price shoppers. And you either saw this 25% off discount or you got your normal manufacturer's standard retail price, no offer, in other words. And so what we did is just basically split the groups, split these people into 2 different groups, and saw what happened when we offered these promotions. So if our theory held true, what we intended to see was that there would be a larger incremental revenue from the discount seekers who are offered the promotion, validating the fact that this group really does need this discount they're really influenced by that discount. Whereas the full price shoppers, we expect there wouldn't be much of a discount or much of a difference between the incremental revenue. But once we were done with our test and we were looking at the metrics, we saw some really strange things here. So for the discount group at the top, the blue being the people in control, there's almost no difference in the conversion rate from the people who saw the 25% offer, which was very different than what we anticipated. Additionally, for the people who were these full price shoppers, we all really thought these models would be sort of flipped, both in the control and the blue-green as well as the discount full price. What we saw was completely opposite than what we anticipated. So apparently the full price people were converting more when they weren't getting a promotion. And that was another big flag. Like, what are we actually seeing here? So we dug in further and we started looking at how much of the people converted, how much were they participating, how much were they, was their revenue per transaction. And again, we saw the incremental revenue was coming from the control. The discount group was very slim, whereas for the full price shoppers, it was much larger. These are all things that, for me, it was saying that I don't know about these models, but it's probably not what we labeled them as originally. So we continued diving in even further, and we started looking at the individual units that each group was looking at. So here's a histogram. Basically, the height of each column is the number of units sold, and left to right, to the right-hand side are the more expensive products. And if you look, it's pretty clear that the full-price shoppers were, instead of this being a natural sort of bell curve here, we saw the discount group very far skewing to the left and the full price skewing to the right. And so this told us that what we were looking at maybe wasn't what we were hoping for with a discount sensitivity sort of segmentation, but more of a price sensitivity, that we had people that just shopped in different price tiers. So at the end of the day, to try to make this very complex experiment overly simplified, what we found though was our segments weren't what we were hoping for. It wasn't this holy grail of these discount seekers and full price shoppers, but instead we had people who preferred cheaper products or more expensive products. And this was just a natural sort of result of the fact that we were doing this with non-objective segmentation methods, things like k-means, clustering, and logistic regressions, and things like that, that basically find commonalities in our customers without trying to first identify these goal personas or goal groups. We're just trying to find some commonalities, which is not to say that it's not useful, because what we've been able to do is we iterated on this experiment. Now knowing that these people are probably more likely to purchase high or low products, now we've done things like inform their product recommendations on site, or when they get to a product listings pages where you have a list of 50 different products, well, we can pre-filter those products depending on what group that these people are in. And additionally, it's something that we've been using for off-site marketing as well. So in the email that they receive, or in their Facebook ads or their retargeting ads, are we showing them the lowest price products, or are we showing the higher price products? What we really found from this original experiment was that what we were promoting were some of our cheapest discounted products, and that is, well, at least our theory is that is why we saw those wonky metrics at the end. But overall, what this showed us is that there's a lot of ways that you can validate these models and these different types of segmentation, but using an A/B testing methodology is critical to really understanding the differences between what you think is happening and what really is happening. And so that is hopefully, yeah, we have 5 minutes left. So that is
you did great.
in a nutshell.
All right, we have questions already. Neha wants to know, was the 25% off at an overall product level, or was it specific to certain SKUs?
It was most of our product listing. That was one of the goals. One of the conversations we have internally is what's on our exclusion list. What products do we not include? And often some of our core, most popular product, we try to keep off of these promotions. But for the purpose of the test, we argued strongly that we needed to have very few things on that exclusion list.
All right, and Tim Wilson is asking, any possibility you could actually do a test that tries different discount amounts and calculate price elasticity, and consequently construct a demand curve that would inform optimal base pricing? And then he said,
we actually have done that separately, done some price elasticity type of experiments. When you layer in both the personas or segmentation on top of that, it gets pretty complex. But we have tried to understand either through testing or through just analysis where those optimal price curves and discount curves start to fall. Because that was, after coming out of this, that was one of the big questions, was 25% the right number? Sometimes, we have higher, sometimes we have lower. And granted, there's people who are probably more incentivized for different types of promotions, whether it's a BOGO or a 25% off, or buy 10, get $2. There's a huge myriad of different types of promotions, and that's where we tended to focus a lot of our effort, is just understanding those promotional levers and how they impact the different types of customers. But we often do that more on a, after the test, let's now go and look at specific segments and how they performed.
All right, last question. What technology hosts your customer profiling info? Seems like you're sharing profile data wildly. That's from Neve.
What we're doing for activating upon our audience, we're using Adobe Audience Manager. This test, though, was prior to us doing that, and we did a lot of, the model itself was built offline. It wasn't an actively updating model. It was crunching all the numbers once, putting everybody into a group, and just sort of validating whether or not the models work. And the activation portion was done through a combination of demandware, customer grouping, and targeting based off of Facebook and our email manager, targeting based off their email address or other types of IDs. So it was a very manual process to try to split these groups up originally, but it was also with the understanding that this would, if we could prove out that this works, that this would validate having a tool like Audience Manager that we could more easily put these groups into play and test off of our other tools.
Awesome. Thank you, Connor. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
We have 2 minutes left. Paula, do you want to try, or do you want to defer?
I'm happy to go very quickly if you'd like.
Sure. Connor, can you stop sharing the screen so if she needs it?
So I'll go ahead and start talking.
Yes, go right ahead.
Let me know. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. I am actually afraid to go into presentation mode because it hasn't, I got a bunch of screens going on and we're short on time.
Go for it.
So my my use cases are a bit lame compared to the rest of yours, but hopefully some of you will find this a little helpful. We did a series of iterations on our frequency program enrollment form, and we were essentially calling them decluttering exercises. So I just thought I would share some of them with you. This is the first test. On the left is the default, and on the right is the winner. You can see essentially what we removed here. This was just an A/B, and we removed the nav and greatly shrunk the logo. We also removed the widget, the search widget. So this was a little controversial, but we found an enormous amount of an enormous increase in enrollments, and we had very little search activity from this page ever. So we were able to get our leadership past that fear. So we found this right one was a winner. So next step, the winner that we implemented is up here on the left, and we did a series of tests now to test into what column format was the best. So essentially, this is 1 column, 2 column, 3 columns, and you can likely guess the winner was 1 column. So for the final test, we took this 1 column and implemented that, and tested into the, we also tested the mobile screen for the first time. The mobile screen obviously had always been 1 column, and we tested removing the address fields. So this was controversial because we need to collect addresses in order to actually enroll a user. And so what you can see here is just the address 1 and 2 fields we removed. Operationally, this was a challenge for our hotels, but it tested as the winner as well. So we are working on figuring out a way to implement that.
And did you capture the address like on step 2, or just not capture them?
We didn't. We ended up, we had Maximizer pass a dummy field over into the reservation system, or excuse me, into the
so that it would accept a partial record. You filled in the dummy data.
And then we just hope the details collected.
That is creative. I have not heard that solution yet.
Jerry rigging.
Yeah. Well, fantastic job sharing that in 2 minutes. I'm really impressed. I know people might have questions. Again, reach out to Paula on the TLC Slack or through the TLC calls channel if you do have questions. Did you guys like this format? Those of you still on? Yeah, you actually have to say something, or thumbs up or nod or something.
Yes.
Yeah? Yeah? Okay. So I'll send out a survey and we'll decide if this is something we want to do on a regular basis. I learned a lot. Hope you guys did too. Thanks everybody, and have a great weekend.